You think medieval love was all knights rescuing maidens and fairy tale weddings? Think again. Behind the castles and ballads was a world where stalking was considered romantic, 12-year-olds were sold as brides, and the church preached that enjoying sex with your own spouse was a sin. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where love wasn't about happily ever after, but about ownership, violence, and suffering. And the craziest part? Some of those twisted ideas still shape love today. Section 1. The Cult of Yearning. Think you know what true love looked like 1,000 years ago. Forget roses, candlelit dinners, or even basic sanity. In the courts of medieval Europe, the highest form of romance wasn't about getting the girl, it was about never getting her at all. They called it fin amour, what we now label courtly love. But don't let the poetic French name fool you. At its core, it was a philosophy that turned emotional suffering into an Olympic sport. Picture this: a knight falls hopelessly in love with Lady Alessandra, the young wife of an influential baron. Instead of moving on, instead of maybe, I don't know, trying therapy, he dedicates his entire life to pining after her. He writes endless poems about his torment. He kneels at her feet during banquets, whispering that her indifference is sweeter than the sun itself. He even rides into battle with her embroidered scarf tied around his helmet, convinced that every blow he takes is proof of his undying devotion. And Lady Alessandra? She's not allowed to reciprocate. In fact, if she ever showed him kindness, she risked being labeled cheap or common. Her job was to remain aloof, untouchable, an ice queen carved out of marble. A smile from her was supposed to fuel his torment for another year. A single kind word was meant to plunge him into deeper despair. One troubadour from Provence described this beautifully twisted system in a song. The truest lover is the one who suffers most. Imagine being told that insomnia, starvation, and low-grade madness were not just romantic, they were required. Knights began to compete over who could prove the depth of their misery. Some stopped eating, claiming food lost its flavor without their lady's touch. Others wandered for months in foreign lands, dressed in rags, to demonstrate that their suffering was holy. There's even a tale of Sir Gautier of Rouen, who carved his beloved's initials into his chest with a dagger just to show his loyalty. People applauded this as noble. In the twisted hierarchy of medieval romance, actually winning the love of your lady was embarrassing. That was the stuff of peasants. True nobility meant never reaching the finish line. So entire lifetimes were spent in elaborate performances of yearning, noblemen obsessively chasing the unattainable, noblewomen trapped in roles that forced them to deny their own feelings. And this wasn't just poetry. Letters, legal documents, even chronicles show how courtly love warped real relationships among the elite. It was romance as performance art. The point wasn't joy or partnership, it was exquisite, socially sanctioned misery. Section 2. Marriage as Marketplace. If you think medieval weddings were about tender vows and blushing brides, brace yourself. Forget romance. Marriage in the Middle Ages was basically a business merger, with a side of livestock thrown in. Picture this: it's the year 1247. In a drafty hall somewhere in Burgundy, two noble families sit across from each other at a long oak table. There's bread, there's wine, but nobody's here for dinner. They're negotiating a marriage contract. On one side, Lord Giaffre, grizzled and sharp-eyed, flanked by scribes with quills. On the other, Lady Isabeau's father, nervously adjusting his fur cloak. The discussion goes like this: how many acres of vineyard will be transferred? Will the dowry include horses or just cattle? What's the penalty if the bride is deemed barren? Notice what's missing. Any mention of the bride herself. Lady Isabeau, barely 12 years old, waits outside the hall. She has no voice in the matter. When the doors open, she will learn who her husband is the same way one might learn the weather forecast, something decided far above her control. And this wasn't unusual. Children as young as 7 were formally betrothed. Families wrote binding contracts, sealed with wax and witnesses, that treated these kids like pieces on a chessboard. If someone tried to back out later, there were fines, feuds, sometimes even armed skirmishes. Love was not only irrelevant, it was suspicious. If a boy and girl actually wanted to marry each other, families worried something fishy was going on. The dowry system made the arrangement even bleaker. A daughter was essentially a price tag. "I'll give you 3 cows, 50 acres, and my eldest girl in exchange for your son." Families haggled like they were buying and selling horses. And yes, there were clauses in these contracts about what happened if the merchandise was defective. If the bride didn't produce male heirs, she could be cast aside, sometimes sent back like spoiled goods. One record from Milan describes a case where a man annulled his marriage because his bride failed to thrive. A chilling phrase that reduced a living woman to broken equipment. And the girls themselves? Many never saw their families again after the wedding feast. They were shipped off to strange households, sometimes to distant lands, where they were expected to bear children for men who viewed them as walking insurance policies. So while troubadours were writing flowery verses about the agony of unfulfilled desire, real medieval marriage looked a lot more like corporate law, with bloodlines and property rights taking center stage. Marriage wasn't about building a life together, it was about merging estates, forging alliances, and securing heirs. The bride's feelings, hopes, and dreams didn't even make it into the footnotes. Section 3. The Church's Crusade Against Desire. Now, if you thought marriage negotiations were bleak, wait until you hear what the medieval church had to say about sex. Spoiler, it wasn't. Light a few candles, pour some wine, and enjoy. It was more like, do it quickly, feel guilty, and repent immediately. Medieval theologians launched what can only be described as a holy war against human pleasure. According to sermons, commentaries, and manuals whispered to the faithful, enjoying sex, even inside marriage, was sinful. Yes, even if you were just trying to make babies. The logic went like this. Before Adam and Eve's fall, humans reproduced without desire, like plants scattering pollen in the wind. The fact that it felt good now. Proof that the devil had wormed his way into the flesh. Priests thundered from pulpits that lust was the devil's favorite weapon. Monks scribbled long treatises about how female bodies were dangerous snares set by Satan to lure men into damnation. Women, of course, got the worst of it. They were portrayed as naturally lustful, corrupting forces, temptresses who could derail a man's soul with a glance. The rules got absurd. Church calendars dictated when couples were allowed to touch each other. No sex on Sundays, too holy, Wednesdays, the day Judas betrayed Christ. Fridays, the day of the crucifixion, and Saturdays, the eve of the Sabbath. On top of that, no sex during Lent, no sex during Advent, no sex while she was pregnant, breastfeeding, menstruating, or recovering from childbirth. Do the math, and you're left with maybe 40 days a year where marital relations weren't technically a sin. And even then, husbands and wives were encouraged to approach the act with sorrow, as medicine taken for illness. One popular manual compared intercourse to drinking a bitter tonic. You only do it because you have to, and you should grimace the whole time. There's a chilling anecdote from a 13th century penitential guide. A man confessed he actually enjoyed intimacy with his wife. The priest told him to abstain for 40 days, pray daily, and donate bread to the poor, essentially a punishment for feeling human. Doctors even got in on it. Some wrote that lovesickness was a diagnosable condition. Young men who wasted away from desire were prescribed bleeding, fasting, and, in extreme cases, exorcisms. Imagine going to your local healer because you had a crush, and leaving with leeches on your arm. The net result? A culture where marriage wasn't a celebration of love, but a damage control system, designed to contain the evil of sexuality inside rigid, joyless walls. Celibacy was preached as superior to marriage, and marriage was seen as just barely better than burning in hell. So while troubadours strummed lutes about longing and nobles signed contracts over livestock, the church stood above them all, shaking its finger and saying, "If you enjoyed that kiss, you're already halfway to damnation." Section 4. Violence as proof of love. If the church told people to fear desire, society found its own workaround, violence. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't proven with flowers or whispered confessions. It was proven with broken bones, spilled blood, and the occasional kidnapping. Let's take Sir Renaud, a knight from Champagne. Chroniclers say he once won the affection of Lady Marguerite by storming her father's manor, fighting off her guards, and carrying her away on horseback. Did anyone call this abduction? Assault? Not at all. Poets sang of it as a romantic conquest. Her opinion, of course, was never recorded. This logic wasn't rare, it was standard. If a man wanted a woman badly enough to risk death in the process of seizing her, that was considered proof of true love. Consent was a minor detail, usually ignored. And the tournaments? Forget the glamorous image of polite justs with banners fluttering. These were blood-soaked spectacles, half sporting event, half dating ritual. Knights pummeled each other with lances and swords while women sat in the stands, expected to swoon at the carnage. A knight who left the field bruised, bleeding, and half dead was considered the most romantic of all. It didn't stop there. Men were expected to fight duels over women's honor, start wars to defend a beloved's reputation, or slaughter enemies in her name. There's a grisly tale of Count Henri of Anjou, who challenged 3 rivals at once because they questioned his devotion to Lady Adeline. He won the duel, but barely survived, and was celebrated in songs as a paragon of romance. Even more disturbing was the so-called right of the first night, whispered about in chronicles. In theory, feudal lords claimed the right to sleep with newlywed brides before their husbands did. While historians debate how widespread this practice actually was, its very existence in rumor and legend reveals how normalized the fusion of sex, power, and violence had become. For peasants, marriage began with the threat of violation. For nobles, it was a test of whether a groom would fight, maybe even die, to prove his love. And women? They were conditioned to admire this brutality. Literature of the time hammered home the idea that gentle, peaceful men were weak, unworthy, laughable. A suitor was only worth considering if he could dominate others through force. A timid man wins no lady, one chanson bluntly declared. It's a grim picture, a society where beating rivals into pulp was romantic, and where kidnapping was just another form of courtship. Love and violence weren't opposites, they were synonyms. So when we imagine medieval couples gazing tenderly at one another, let's be honest, more often, someone was bleeding in the mud, and someone else was clapping about how noble it all was. Section 5. Women as Objects of Ownership. To really grasp medieval romance, you have to abandon any idea that women were seen as people in their own right. In practice, and in law, they were property. Valuable, yes. Treasured sometimes. But still things to be owned, transferred, or stolen. Look at the language of the time. Men didn't marry women, they claimed them. A suitor didn't court a lady, he won her, like a prize at the end of a bloody tournament. And in many cases, that's exactly what women were, literal prizes. At tournaments in Flanders, knights who triumphed in combat were sometimes awarded women alongside horses and gold. Imagine a cheering crowd as 2 men bludgeon each other nearly to death, and at the end, the winner is handed a lady's hand in marriage, whether she wanted it or not. That wasn't the scandal. That was the point. And once claimed, a woman's identity was swallowed whole by her husband. A daughter was owned by her father until she was handed off like chattel. A wife's legal existence merged entirely with her husband's. She couldn't own land, make contracts, or testify in court without his permission. If she committed adultery, it wasn't a crime against the marriage bond, it was theft of property. Another man had stolen what belonged to her husband. Even romantic literature reveals this mindset. Ballads speak of women being taken, seized, or conquered. Love poems compare women to castles, fortresses to be stormed, defended, or lost in battle. And it wasn't just metaphor. During raids and wars, capturing women was a legitimate military prize. Chronicles describe soldiers boasting of how many maidens they had won from enemy villages. These captives were then expected, by society, by storytellers, by their captors themselves, to somehow fall in love with the men who had destroyed their lives. Take the case of Lady Isabella of Naples. Her town was sacked during a border conflict, and she was carried off by a rival nobleman. Within months, songs celebrated her as his devoted wife, as if her own will had played any role in the matter. The bards didn't write about her grief, her fear, or her shattered family. They wrote about the knight's passion and courage, as though her suffering was just a footnote to his glory. In this world, women were never participants in romance. They were the prizes that romance revolved around. Love wasn't a shared bond, it was a competition among men, with women as the trophies at the finish line. So when you read those medieval love songs about ladies with hearts of gold and eyes that shine brighter than the dawn, remember, beneath the flowery words was a brutal truth. The woman in question wasn't being adored. She was being collected. Section 6. The glorification of tragedy. For us, a great love story usually ends with two people finally overcoming obstacles and living happily ever after. But for medieval Europe, happiness was cheap, ordinary, peasant stuff. The real proof of love, they believed, was tragedy. The more suffering, the more noble the romance. And if it all ended in death? Perfect. That was the gold standard. Take the doomed tale of Sir Roland of Aquitaine and Lady Seraphine. Chroniclers swooned over their perfect devotion. Here's the story. Roland loved Seraphine, who was unfortunately married off in a political deal to a much older count. Did they run away together? No. Instead, Roland spent years writing poems about his despair, fighting duels in her honor, and bleeding on battlefields to prove his undying devotion. Finally, when whispers of their secret affection reached the Count, Roland was challenged to a duel. Both men died, leaving Seraphine a widow at 19. Did people call this a tragedy? Not at all. They praised it as the model of romantic perfection. This wasn't just one story. Over and over, medieval literature glorified romances that ended in destruction. The more spectacular the suffering, the nobler the love. Ballads celebrated lovers who wasted away from heartbreak, or who flung themselves from towers rather than live without each other. Physicians of the time even described amor hurios, love sickness, as a genuine disease that could kill if untreated. Some remedies included bleeding, fasting, or pilgrimage, none of which sound particularly helpful if your real problem was just a bad breakup. In aristocratic circles, it became fashionable to compete for the most tragic romance. Nobles engineered impossible love affairs, deliberately courting disaster, as if misery itself was a badge of status. To actually marry the person you loved? That was dull. Pedestrian? To die for love? Now that was aristocratic. There are even accounts of suicide framed as noble sacrifice. One song from Provence tells of two lovers who, forbidden to wed, drowned themselves in the same river on the same night. Instead of condemning it as despair, audiences wept and praised it as proof of a love too pure for this world. So ingrained was this obsession that even centuries later, when Shakespeare penned Romeo and Juliet, he wasn't inventing a new tragic formula. He was recycling one already worn thin by medieval storytellers. The idea that love should destroy you, that the highest proof of devotion was death, was a medieval inheritance. For the nobles, living happily together was mundane. Dying beautifully together was sublime. Section 7. Echoes in the Present. It's easy to laugh off medieval romance as a bizarre chapter of history, all knights and castles and bad hygiene. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A lot of those warped ideas didn't vanish, they evolved. They're still lurking in how we talk about love today. Think about the glorification of suffering. The medieval knight who starved himself for Lady Alisanda has his modern cousin in the person who insists, "Real love hurts." How many pop songs still equate obsession, jealousy, or heartbreak with proof of passion? The medieval equation of love with pain is alive and well every time someone says, "If you're not suffering, it's not real." Or take the marriage as business model. Okay, we're not trading daughters for cows anymore, at least not in most parts of the world, but echoes remain. Families still pressure kids into good matches. Weddings are still loaded with financial transactions. Dowries may have faded, but expensive engagement rings and six-figure ceremonies aren't exactly free of commerce. The idea that love should also be a deal, a merger of wealth or status, has very old roots. The Church's war on desire? Echoes remain there too. Certain religious traditions still stigmatize sexuality, especially female sexuality, as something dangerous or corrupting. The medieval notion that women's desire is a trap hasn't entirely disappeared, it just changed costume. From purity culture to modern slut-shaming, the shadow is still there. What about violence as proof of love? Today we call it toxic masculinity. But the medieval script is clear: the man who fights hardest, who dominates rivals, who proves himself through aggression, is the one most worthy. Look at blockbuster movies where the hero wins the girl not by talking to her, but by beating up the villain in her name. Swap swords for guns, and the plot is pure medieval. And the obsession with tragic endings? You see it every time a story glorifies the couple who can't be together, as more romantic than the ones who actually make it work. The idea that love is validated by destruction, by dying young, by burning out instead of fading, is still romanticized in books, films, and songs. We don't live in castles anymore. We swipe left and right instead of composing ballads. But the skeleton of medieval romance still rattles underneath the skin of modern dating culture. We inherited a story that says love should be painful, transactional, violent, and tragic. And maybe, just maybe, that's why so many of us still struggle with what healthy love is supposed to look like. Because for centuries, Europe trained itself to believe that happily ever after wasn't the goal. The goal was suffering beautifully, dying dramatically, and calling it noble.